Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Nebraska very much. I rise in strong support of my bill, H.R. 4467, the Strengthening Aviation Security Act. Mr. Speaker, last year I learned that while the Federal Air Marshal Service considers its travel budget and the number of personnel when determining which flights will be covered by air marshals, they do not consider risk. This current system might maximize the number of flights covered by air marshals, but it does not ensure that the highest risk flights, those likely to be hijacked by a potential terrorist, would be covered by air marshals. The Strengthening Aviation Security Act would fix this flawed policy by requiring the Federal Air Marshal Service to incorporate risk in its deployment strategy in 3 ways. First, this legislation requires the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize risk-based strategy when allocating resources between international and domestic flight coverage. Currently, the Federal Air Marshal Service does not account for risk when it sets its annual target numbers of average international and domestic flights to cover. Second, this legislation requires the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize a risk-based strategy to support domestic allocation decisions. Currently, these decisions are made based on the professional judgment of subject matter experts. Without documented risk assessments, the Federal Air Marshal Service cannot justify to TSA, the Department of Homeland Security, or Congress why it chooses to deploy air marshals on certain flights and not on others. Third, this legislation requires the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize a risk-based strategy to support international allocation decisions. Shockingly, the Federal Air Marshal Service does not currently document the rationales for their international allocation decisions. Without this documentation, there is no verifiable method to determine whether decisions are intelligence-driven, risk-based, or even in compliance with TSA or DHS directives. Unless the Federal Air Marshal Service accounts for risk at every level of its deployment strategy, it cannot ensure that it is devoting its resources to cover high-risk flights. It is incumbent upon us in Congress to address any vulnerabilities to our national security and enable our federal agencies to effectively deter, detect, and disrupt any attacks planned by our enemies, and this legislation does just that. I'd like to thank Chairman McCall, Chairman Katko for their strong support of this legislation, and I urge all my colleagues to support